Господа, мы начинаем вторую панель. Я думаю, она будет не менее интересная, чем первая. Вы можете пропустить самое интересное, потому что мы начинаем в первую очередь с МВФ. Я думаю, что, в принципе, я просто созываю.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, just wanted to say thank you to our speakers in the previous panel. I think that was very constructive and interesting. So now the second part of the macro panel, local outlook. And we will concentrate on local issues such as recent macroeconomic outlook for Ukraine, priorities for the next 2-3 years, outlook for hryvnia, progress with IMF, relations with Russia. So everything we are talking, watching and listening about every day. Our speakers today will be Max Alier, resident representative of IMF in Ukraine, Rufat Alimardanov, country head in Ukraine and Belarus at IFC, Alexey Timofeyev, head of smart energy business at Smart Holding, Ruslav Pionkivsky, senior economist at World Bank, Volodymyr Lavrenchuk, chairman of the board at Raiffeisen Bank Aval, and our moderator is the same, Andrei Bespyatov, the president of CFA Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We shall probably start, and I'll probably do the same thing. It's my honor, and no one will take it from me, to represent our speakers in more details. I'll go again from left to right. Mr. Alexey Timofeyev, he is CEO of Smart Energy and previously Deputy CEO for Smart Holding, one of the largest industrial and financial groups in Ukraine. He has a vast experience in oil and gas sector, and he was in leading position in J Alliance, in Naftogaz Ukraine, and sitting on the board members of largest Ukrainian oil and gas companies like Chernomor, Naftogaz, Ukrtransnafta, Ukrspetsgaz, and so on. So I think his experience about the gas issue will be of very important for us. Next, please welcome Ruslan Pionkivsky, a senior economist of World Bank. Ruslan Pionkivsky works in World Bank since 2003, and he participated in policy dialogue with the government top officials on macroeconomic, fiscal, and structural reforms for the country. He has a broader, also regional experience in macroeconomic in Belarus, Cyprus, Kazakhstan, Moldova, and South Caucasus countries. Mr. Rufat Alimardanov, he is a country head in Ukraine and Belarus of International Financial Corporation. Before coming to Ukraine, he was the head of business development for manufacturing and services sector for Eastern Europe, and he is working in the IFC for the last 14+ years and dealing with manufacturing, food processing, and financial sectors in different countries, including Russia, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Croatia, Turkey, and so on. Mr. Volodymyr Lavrenchuk is the chairman of Bank Aval. I think everyone knows this person. He was named as the best banker of Ukraine for many years, and he is in this industry for like 30 years. So I think his knowledge about the banking sector, because it's a blood of our economy, would be of utmost importance. And the last but not least, and we thank you for coming, Mr. Max Alier, resident representative in Ukraine of International Monetary Fund. Max is staying here for the last almost 4 years. Previously, he was a resident representative in Brazil for 4 years. He headed the fund mission in Trinidad and Tobago. He worked with different assignments with Argentina, Ecuador, Chile, Peru, Indonesia. So I think we have a very great panel, quite diverse. So we'll have, we can ask different questions to different people. We'll start with quite simple questions so far. We'll start with what Ukraine achieved and failed to achieve in 2012. I'll probably start, if you please, with Max Alier.
Thanks. I want to thank first CFA and the organizers for inviting me to be here. These are very interesting times, I think, for the world and for Ukraine in particular. 2012 was a challenging year, I believe, again, broadly. Towards the end of 2011, we had this kind of second round of European crisis that started in September, October of last year. That did have implications for countries like Ukraine. Access to capital markets became more difficult. At the same time, Western European banks also starting some deleveraging process that not only for Ukraine, I mean for their operations in Central and Eastern Europe and in other parts. So on the capital side and the capital inflows, that did put a challenge to Ukraine. Earlier in 2012, there were all these concerns and doubts on what was the situation in China and some emerging markets. That did have an impact on commodity prices and most relevant for Ukraine on steel prices and metal prices. So Ukraine had to face that challenge also. On the agricultural front, prices held relatively well throughout the year. However, the harvest was somewhat weaker than last year because the previous year was very, very strong. So obviously, Ukraine had to confront a year full of challenges. It had to confront a year full of challenges that also included very large financing needs, both for the government and for the economy as a whole. And under these circumstances, you had some factors domestically that also introduced some noise, including the elections. Elections in many countries do produce uncertainties. Ukraine is no exception, and actually is almost the example of how this happens. I mean, every time there are elections here, there's all these uncertainties about what's going to happen afterwards. I think the first half of the year, output was growing quite strong. Momentum was quite strong. That was being kept from the previous 2 years. However, I think in the second half of the year, as pressure started mounting on the currency, and also there was a fiscal expansion that started in the summer, and basically what the outcome from the supplementary budget of April of this year. Well, the National Bank has put a strong defense of the currency and the existing peg. It has had the consequence that interest rates have gone up, and so a combination of this with the difficulties to access capital markets had led to a slowdown in economic activity. So while on the front of economic activity, the year started quite strong, it has weakened towards the end. Inflation is, I believe, is an important achievement. Inflation has been kept very low and is currently running at about 0 on a 12-month basis. So I think it was a challenging year. I think we are coming to the end, and I think the investors and also the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian population is trying or expecting some of the uncertainties to be resolved now that the elections are over. People who follow international markets have seen that as some of the questions and doubts about emerging markets, and particularly China, have calmed down. You see commodity prices recovering a little bit. Metal prices have already started to recover. As for capital markets, I think the situation remains kind of uncertain. We saw this week the government was able to place $1.5 billion in Eurobonds, 10-year Eurobonds, at a relatively low rate compared to previous placements. I think those are good news. That means at least this week we're going to a spot of capital markets accessibility for a country like Ukraine. But given the uncertainties, we don't know how we're going to look forward. I think later on we're going to talk about the outlook for 2013. But as I said, if I had to summarize, I think 2012, a year full of external events that made challenging to navigate, combined with the uncertainty of the elections. We have a mixed bag of outcomes. Strong output growth in the beginning of the year, declining toward the second half. Inflation was maintained low, and on the fiscal, some loosening that probably it would have been better not to have. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe Ruslan, you can add a few points from World Bank, how you see it.
First, actually, thank you for invitation for this event, and I think Max has covered very nicely the main features of situation in 2012 and how Ukraine was placed in this global context and global influences. Of course, being quite open economy and quite exposed to European global markets, to some commodity markets, Ukraine can't avoid some of the influences, and the size of this exposure is such, and in some cases Ukraine could only adopt or kind of soften the impact in a way. That's why when the global economy slowed down, when the largest trading partner has slowed down, actually some of the key countries went into recession, Ukraine couldn't continue growing at the same pace for this year. That's why we have been changing our forecast as we saw the situation approaching. And our most recent forecast for 2012 was released in July, which we do like twice a year. It was 2% growth at the time, so below the official one, but it was clear that there would be deceleration in the second half of the year as compared to the first half, which showed 2.5% and 3% growth in the second quarter that we're experiencing now. I would say that the results for the third quarter are quite on the lower side as compared to kind of initial projections. That's why the final outcome for the year might be a little bit on the lower side from what we thought just a couple of months ago. This is due to kind of quite low numbers for agriculture and also deceleration and decline in industrial production. But also looking for the coming months, looking a little bit ahead, I think it will improve a bit in the last quarter, and we will see some improvement of the results in the fourth quarter as compared to the third quarter. So situation is not disastrous in a way. At the same time, I think from the policy side, domestically, the situation was defined by two factors. The first is the monetary policy that was anchored to the exchange rate peg, that defined basically the use of other instruments, and that defined quite high real interest rates that the economy faced, that defined low inflation, that also defined almost no growth in credit, and also it contributed to actually decelerating economic activity for the year as compared to the other counterfactual if the monetary policy would be more flexible. I would have been more flexible. So that's the first big pillar, I would say, of the economic policy mix that defines the situation in 2012. The second big part is of course fiscal loosening, fiscal stimulus introduced in late spring of over 2 percentage points of GDP that stimulated domestic demand, that kept some industries and some indicators growing at quite high pace in real terms, such as retail turnover. And also, I think it contributed to softening this impact of lower growth, lower external demand, and weak commodity prices on Ukraine economy, and it also would reveal itself in a bit higher growth indicators. But it also resulted in a higher deficit of the public finance. If you look at the kind of extended picture, if you look at general government plus the operational deficit of Naftogaz, not just a narrow deficit of state budget or consolidated budget, and this poses challenges for next year actually. On the external side, I would highlight just one feature, one point, which would relate to I wouldn't say decoupling, but divergence of commodity prices that affect Ukraine both on export side and import side. As you know, on import side, Ukraine is affected by oil prices that affect gas prices according to the formula with some lag, and on export side, most important is steel prices. And this year we saw a bit of a divergence, so the steel prices went down quite a bit, while European oil prices that define Ukraine gas, formula-based gas price stayed pretty much the same. That's why this negative terms of trade effect actually affected the dynamics of the economy this year and have implication also for at least the first half of next year. That's, I think, are my highlights for the current year. We'll talk a bit more probably about the future in a moment.
I might ask a following question, like in addition to that, like me personally, I sometimes hate September for macro statistics from year to year. Every time something happens. This year it was industrial output like dropping significantly, and we have a lot of real sector here. So October numbers were, well, negative, but still better. So do you personally, with the World Bank, think that it was the bottom that we saw in September? We should expect some improvement?
I think if you look at some of the short-term indicators, I would expect some improvement. Maybe on the monthly basis, there could be some, some drop, some, kind of non-behavior out of a trend due to some particular contract in one of the industries. And we know that some industries are exposed to these one-off events. But in general, I would expect the dynamics to be a little bit better in November and December of this year as compared to this low -7.
So related to industry, I will please ask Rufat, how do you see the investment climate now, and how do you see it influencing the industries overall, or maybe the industries that IFC investing in or considering to invest in?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak at this esteemed forum and participate at this panel. In terms of the investment climate, even if the macroeconomic situation is strong and healthy, for the investors it's very important to have the predictable and friendly investment climate. And when you have issues and challenges, it becomes even more important. So what's the situation in Ukraine? All of us have our personal experiences, anecdotes from friends and colleagues, but if we try to rise above and just look at the overall economy, one of the indicators available in the market is quite well known to you as a Doing Business report, which is done every year jointly by IFC and the World Bank. If we look at the latest report, Ukraine has improved by 15 notches. So that's a great achievement if you look at the number. But if you look at the place Ukraine has taken, it's 137, meaning that 136 economies in the world have been reforming faster. So it's a relative ranking. So there's a way to go and improve. But what is behind this improvement that we've seen this year? Was it real or just a coincidence of some factors that were followed because the Doing Business report is tracking only specific number of parameters? I think it was real. There were quite a few improvements. In 3 areas, Ukraine has been, because of the improvements in the 3 areas, Ukraine was among the top 10 reformers worldwide if we look at the countries that reformed in 3 or more areas. And the 3 areas for Ukraine were starting business is where the improvement has been observed, registering property, and paying taxes. And what is really behind this improvement? So in terms of the starting business, there was elimination of the minimum capital required for companies to register, and also the abolition of the requirement to notarize documentation when you open the business. Small thing, but it's a good improvement, quite important for doing business, especially when it comes to smaller, medium-sized companies. Registering property has become also easier. Property transfers become easier, more effective. Time limit has been introduced. If we look at the Kyiv example, for example, when it comes to land transfers and so on. Paying taxes due to introduction of the electronic filing system and payment for mid-size and large corporates. So there have been some improvements. We in IFC actually go beyond this Doing Business indicator and survey periodically every year or two about 2,000 enterprises. These are small companies, individuals, and also some large companies, to see how widespread the situation is and the challenges and the improvements are. If we look at the most recent study we've done and the update which was done just last year, we can observe the following trends, and they're mixed. Obviously there's some challenges there too. If we look at, for example, permitting, inspections, and certifications and licensing, the Ukrainian companies have spent about 7.2 billion hryvnia. This is the cost to private business in complying with all of these regulations and inspections. This includes staff time, formal and informal payments. So some of it could be really required because in the economy you should have licensing and inspections. It's necessary, but the mere number 7.2 billion is huge in the context of the Ukrainian reality. So obviously it's a big cost to business that is reducing the efficiency. In terms of the inspections themselves, there have been some improvement. There's a positive trend there. Despite the experiences we hear about, the overall situation based on the sample, there was some improvement. If in 2010, for example, about 74% of respondents said that they were inspected, in 2011 it was 68%, so some improvement there. In terms of the permitting, again, there was a slight improvement from 32% to 29%. So this is how widespread the permitting is. In terms of corruption, though, if we compare it to 2008, in the last year it was 10%, as opposed to 6% of the overall turnover the companies generate. So this is a huge number, obviously, big problem, nothing surprising here. So this is the situation here, but in terms of the trends that Ukraine probably needs to continue on, and there have been some improvements recently, is certain even legislation and norms that have been adopted. For example, there was in April 2011, there was a law on the list of permits that actually lists all possible potential permits. At least now it's clear what they could potentially be. It's 135 permits. So there is a way to go, but there's a mixed bag of examples. But looking at the overall ranking of 134, it's clear there's a way to go up. And there are some neighboring countries which are doing much better than Ukraine in terms of reforming.
Okay, a quick follow-up question for Alexei. From the viewpoint of large business, do you see that stability and at least some improvement in some areas? How do you feel today as a business?
Мне разрешили говорить по-русски для беглости. В первую очередь хотел бы поблагодарить за приглашение. С точки зрения бизнеса, который осуществляет крупные, достаточно системные прямые инвестиции, я, безусловно, могу сказать, что с точки зрения ощущения компании, которая работает внутри, той самой политической, экономической, инвестиционной системы координат, которые есть, мы однозначно можем сказать, что любая стабилизация, любое повышение прогнозируемости бизнеса, особенно бизнеса, завязанного на значительных капитальных инвестициях, это, конечно, плюс. Если говорить об энергетике, то мировые менеджеры, крупные инвесторы, присутствующие на территории СНГ, их особо политическими рисками не испугаешь. Эти компании привыкли работать в гораздо более жестких условиях, чем наличествует в Украине. Я вообще считаю, что называется, слухи о политических украинских рисках сильно преувеличены, и как бы на самом деле это мое личное мнение, оно может там не совпадать с рейтингами, но это так. Очень часто за вот этими всеми вещами стоят другие причины. Я считаю, что стабильность – это хорошо, стабильность присутствует, предсказуемость бизнеса увеличилась. С точки зрения бизнес-планирования это, безусловно, плюс. Тут просто надо определиться, мы политологи или инвесторы. Если инвесторы, то стало лучше.
Okay, thank you very much. And well, if the economy is stable, if the situation is quite stable, I have a quite simple question to Ruslan. Do we need a resumption of IMF program? Well, I cannot ask this direct question to Max because it would be a conflict of interest. So I'm asking you. Sorry.
In my personal opinion, I think Ukrainian economic policy needs some adjustment, both fiscal policy and monetary policy. And that, I think, is the key and essential. And of course, if Ukraine does this adjustment, it would be most welcome by everybody, including by all of the investors, if this is supported by the IMF program. I think everybody would benefit. But this is up to two parties that are discussing this issue. I wouldn't attach any probabilities to this process.
Okay, so let's assume that we need that. Then the question directly to Max, well, everyone is asking, I'm just redirecting, should we expect renewed cooperation or extension of cooperation with the IMF? Any forecasted time soon? I mean, months, not years.
Well, I mean, we at the fund remain committed to support Ukraine, and we stand ready to engage with Ukraine. What we have so far is the authorities have expressed interest in resuming a program relation with us. What it takes for us is the willingness to negotiate and discuss with us the areas that are very well known by everyone that we have discussed for a long time. These issues are broadly related to gas and energy prices. We also will need to agree on a budget for 2013. We have long advocated the need for exchange rate flexibility. This is an area that we need to discuss. And there's many other areas in which obviously we need to negotiate, and it's part of our relation with Ukraine. You can see them in the program that we have now that expires in December. These include also areas in the banking sector. Well, we have Volodya here. There are important issues like the issue of non-performing loans, for example. That is an outstanding issue from the previous crisis. So what is important to get our support is to be able to put together a package of policies that is consistent, that is makes economic sense, that will not only bring and keep the stability in Ukraine, but also a program that will create the conditions for Ukraine to grow. Obviously, the IMF is not everything, as Rufat was clearly pointing it out. I mean, macroeconomic stability and a good macroeconomic environment is key to have growth, but also there are other areas of reform in which Ukraine's cooperation with the World Bank, with EBRD, with IFC will be essential, and these areas relate to the business environment. So we believe a package that combines policies to achieve and maintain macroeconomic stability along the lines, the ones that I mentioned before, combined with the cooperation with other international financial institutions in more structural issues, is probably what will ensure that Ukraine can develop its potential and can improve the current economic situation. Now, as for timing, basically, is what I said. The authorities have expressed interest in resuming a program relation with us, and we stand ready to start negotiations whenever the government is ready to negotiate on this issue that I mentioned before. Thanks.
Okay, if we start with the IMF with this issue, and knowing that you will have to leave very soon, I will continue with that. And sorry, I know this question has been asked many times, and once again I'll refer to our top officials like Deputy Prime Minister and the head of the National Bank. They're asking if we need to extend an old product or develop a new one product with the IMF. Is there any difference?
Well, for me, it's very interesting because I think this is sort of a non-issue in a sense. It's a bit of a bureaucratic issue. What is important to get the IMF support is to have the right economic policies in place. And that's what we need to agree on. And once we agree on the right economic policies in place, the rest was extension of the old one, a new one, etc. It's a bureaucratic decision. I mean, I don't think there's any practical implication into deciding into one or the other. There's no difference whatsoever. Or anything that is materially important. I think what is really important, and it's not only for us, I believe more importantly, is both for investors and for the people in general, is to see a set and package of policies that is consistent and that it hangs together. And that's what is the fundamental question. I believe more than a bureaucratic one of new, old, or all these things. I don't think that adds much to the discussion.
Let me please continue with that. To be correct, just 10 minutes ago in the foyer, one journalist asked me the following question, as we know, the IMF in its recent report softened the requirements to Ukraine. So will it be easier now for Ukraine to get a resumption of cooperation with the IMF? Can you please provide some comments on that, and if we should expect some changes in some sort of requirements, major ones that we know? This is fiscal, the flexibility in currency, and fiscal, which is the budget and the gas price. So maybe we have some changes here. Thank you.
Well, I don't think I'm going to start discussing and give opinions on a negotiation that had not even started yet to begin with. So, but as I said, what is important, the fundamental challenges of Ukraine remain the same. I think the policies that we will be looking at remain the same. Now start discussing a little bit more here, a little bit more, less there. I think that's part of the negotiation, but fundamentally what we have been asking in the program remains the same.
Probably the last question here on the IMF front. We'll have a Grivna discussion, the last, to keep attention of our audience, because it's the most hotly discussed issue. But still, well, we pretty much know, but do you think it's a good time now for more flexibility for local currency here in Ukraine?
Listen, our advice on the currency is long-standing. It goes back many years. All our reports can be looked back in the website, in our website. I think back to 2005 or 6, and so for many years, our analysis has always been and remains that a country that is highly integrated in the world economy, both in terms of trade and in terms of capital flows, a country that, given the kind of export base that it has, that is heavily concentrated on commodities, and therefore suffers from recurring shocks to the price of their main exports. It has nothing to do with Ukraine. It just happened that it exports commodities and commodity prices fluctuate. Our experience from countries with economies with this kind of characteristics is that they do much, much better having a flexible exchange rate. The flexible exchange rate will allow to a much easier way of absorbing these shocks and facilitate the adjustment. Now, our analysis remains the same. Our recommendation remains the same. There's a lot of experience in the world, in many countries, on how to do the transition from a peg or a de facto peg, as there is in Ukraine, towards a flexible exchange rate regime. Obviously, our advice is never aimed at creating disorderly transition from one system to the next, but we believe that our recommendation stands, and obviously the process needs to be managed carefully and needs to be done properly. That's absolutely on the cards. Now, going back to what I was saying before, even in the context of making a shift from a fixed exchange rate to a flexible exchange rate, I think if we look at the countries that have done this transition, which are the ones that managed to do it voluntarily and in an orderly way, well, a fundamental condition is to have sound macroeconomic policies in place. You cannot try to achieve this transition if you don't have budget discipline. You cannot do this if you have ad hoc rules and things that fuel expectations, because as you do this, especially in countries that have been used for many, many years to base and reference everything to the peg, it's a bit of an educational process in which people understand that what anchored their expectations is not the exchange rate any longer, but it's anchoring on inflation. Many countries that have done this transition eventually adopt inflation targeting regimes. There are many successful countries that have done that. We can discuss that from many, many countries, from Brazil to Chile. Other countries have done transitions more closer to home. We have very successful also in the case of Russia, for example. 10 years ago, thinking of flexibility in the ruble was unthinkable. Today, well, the ruble fluctuates. And I'm not saying Ukraine needs to copy the Russian model. I mean, these are different economies. But I'm saying that an orderly transition from the fixed exchange rate regime to a floating exchange rate regime is feasible. But again, a key precondition is to have a consistent and solid macroeconomic policies in place.
Okay, so probably we'll just finish with your part, if we have probably a few minutes more. As you're saying, you're looking long-term and forward, so maybe you'll provide us your macro priorities for the maybe next year, maybe next few years. Well, do you believe in this opportunity window for Ukraine for next year? And maybe what would you suggest Ukraine should do to push the growth? Well, I know that you will probably leaving sometime next year, but what would you suggest the country to move on, that when you come back in 5 years you would be very much surprised?
First, I hope it doesn't take me 5 years to come, at least to visit, so, because I like Ukraine very much. So, listen, I think my sense is the next year for sure, but maybe even the next couple of years will remain challenging years. Not only for Ukraine, they will remain challenging for the global economy. I think the previous panel also gave that sense in general. Obviously, there's some progress taking place in Western Europe. Everyone is working hard for the situation in Western Europe to stabilize, but obviously this is not a done deal. And even if we have a positive outcome, it may not be a linear progression to improvement. We may have better weeks or better months, and then we have some deterioration. So even if the final outcome is a happy end, I mean, it may not be linear between now and there. So I think that's something that is important to bear in mind. On emerging markets, as I said, one kind of the doubts and questions have been assuaged a little bit, but we don't know. There's still some uncertainty there. So Ukraine needs to be prepared to adapt to changing commodity prices, because fluctuations are likely to keep happening. Now, the biggest challenge I see, this tremendous challenge, is Ukraine have very, very large financing needs in the coming year. I guess, again, both for the government and for the balance of payments. This is not only to finance the deficits, but also there's a very large amount of debts coming due, both for the government and external debts. And Ukraine needs to regain and maintain market access on reasonable terms. No, we cannot keep going to the market at very high rates, because then the situation becomes unsustainable. So we have seen some progress already on the rates coming down, at least on the sovereign. But market access is not just limited to the sovereign. It will also is important for corporates. Ukrainian corporates do have financial obligations coming due. Banks are also an important element, and Volodya later on probably can explain more about this. He knows this in more detail. Banks also need to remain market access. For Western banks, I believe also, if the situation improves, well, those banks who have been withdrawing resources may take a different approach, because they look at the place that offer more opportunities. So I believe those are key challenges. So I don't think it's reasonable to assume a boom next year. Obviously, it's not. I think hopefully there will be some recovery. Hopefully, global conditions will improve. Good news, there will be no elections as far as we know, so therefore that uncertainty will not be on the table. But in terms of priorities, in addition to the macro policies, I would like to insist, and I've been saying this for a long time, I mean, it's okay. I mean, macro policies are the first building block into growth. But in Ukraine, what is the huge deficit is structural policies. There are huge issues in terms of business environment that need to be improved. I mean, that is what will not only attract foreign investment, and not only bringing in foreigners, but it's also make Ukrainians themselves invest and feel comfortable investing in Ukraine. So it's not only about foreigners, it's also about Ukrainians. So Ukrainians, instead of trying to buy dollars and put them under the mattress or whatever they do with the dollars, they feel that it's the best thing for them to do with their money and their savings is to engage in productive activities in Ukraine.
Well, you need to create that environment. So it's not, I think a lot of the time discussions revolve around foreigners coming. Really, it's not about foreigners. It's about Ukrainians. I mean, the good business environment is fundamental for the population to do it. And once people find good opportunities to invest here, I mean, they don't invest in dollars, because why would you invest in something that you have better alternatives? Now, if I want to say it in two elements, one, again, I insist, put together a strong macroeconomic policies, create a first building block. I don't think that it's that difficult. It requires some tough decisions, but it's not that difficult. But then keep moving forward with very decisively on the business environment and structural front.
Thank you very much. Using the power of a moderator, I'll change a little bit our agenda, and because Max will have to leave in a few minutes, if you have one or maybe two really good questions, you can ask them now to Max. Okay. If we don't have questions, then okay, we have one good question. Коля, on front, please. Here, Nikolai. Can you please stand up? Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Alexander Kunchenko. I'm a finance controller for one of oil and gas companies in Ukraine, and as part of my curriculum in university, I've researched to some extent the financial crisis and its repercussions. And my question to Max would be, in your opinion, do you think Ukraine is capable to survive the financial crisis now without the bailout from monetary fund? And if no, will you keep the bureaucratic issues as an excuse for not funding the Ukraine, which apparently would be a good boost for GDP, because it will increase consumption, it will increase apparently government expenditures, which are key drivers for GDP in a short-term perspective. Thank you.
Well, listen, what we do at the end of the day is, when countries need to adjust, we assist them. And I think our assistance has three components. Obviously, the most visible one is the financing, and it's the resources that come with our program, which obviously, well, by having the resources, you can moderate the adjustment. The adjustment, you still need to make it. I mean, you're not going to avoid the adjustment. It's that the financing allows you to do it in a more orderly way. So obviously, that is the first element that comes with our program, and the most visible and the one that gets most attention. The second one, and I believe also gets some attention, it has to do with the component of credibility. You see, the fact that we come in, that we commit our own resources, and that we are a big institution, I mean, we're a global institution, almost universal, it does bring some credibility to these policies. It's a little bit of a seal of approval of the policies. So this serves to reassure investors, and this serves to sometimes even reassure the population and the local people. So in that sense, our program and the fact that we bring our money is just a catalyst for private money and other monies also to be brought in. So that, I think, the second element. Now, the third element is more subtle, and I think it is in our engagement, there's an implicit technical assistance component. Now, we have experience on many of these issues in many countries, in this region of the world, from Asia, from Latin America, from Western Europe. So we have seen many of these problems before. And because we cover all these things, and you see our economy, there's a lot of turnover on people, we can bring to the table and we can bring to the country, and we can share the experiences of other places. What worked, what didn't work, why we believe it worked or why we believe it didn't work. And so we provide that thing. So I think our help, our engagement with us, bring these three things to the table. And those things, in my opinion, is what helps smooth out the path to adjust. Now, in the absence of that, well, I think the economies adjust no matter what. Of course, things may change. Financial conditions may ease. Metal prices may boom. And then, well, things can change, and then you may not need to adjust after all. But if you need to adjust, I think countries find that they end up, the engagement with us tends to smooth out this adjustment. Now, it doesn't mean there are alternatives, but that is not for me to recommend, not for me to decide. I mean, that's a question that really should be posed most to the government officials, because they are the ones who the authorities of the country are the ones that need to decide which path they want to choose.
Okay, thank you very much for Max Alier for being here. Please thank him for staying with us for this time. And we'll continue now, and I have a question to Vladimir Lavrenchuk. After Max was saying about different policies, what do you think about the most probably vital for you? What do you think about the monetary policy that we are dealing with now, and how does it influence Ukrainian banks?
Very good morning to all of you. If I may start with some pre-comments, because I fixed my comments to issues raised before. And shortly, 2012 was very promising in our forecasts. And I follow the previous discussion of the previous panel. Ukraine is a country of big potential. And I would say Ukraine is a country for the very promising next year planning. And 2012 was expected by bankers as one of the better year than 2011 by macroeconomical ratios and by experience we have in October, November 2011 when central bank defended forex rate in a quite severe environment together with all the financial industry. So it was somewhere good experience case that we can manage financial sector altogether, but first of all by governors and supervisors. So 2012 was very promising with our budgets and with our expectations, but closer to the end of the year, we named the year 2012 as a challenging year again, and mostly by the deteriorating or worsening of economical ratios and tough monetary policy you asked me now to comment. So what is the price of stable forex rate? What is the price of low inflation in financial sector is a high interest rates for lending activities. So we have a high level of pricing for money market last 3 months. Yesterday there was up to 50. Last month it's within 30–40% overnight. It's very expensive. And again, in this volatile environment, which we have experienced to work in. So volatile environment is not something new for us, but such kind of pricing moves us in 1995 or somewhere there. So there is no conditions to make a leverage for economy, and I would say we feel not comfortable with that. At the same time, I wouldn't like to dramatize that, as I visited World Economic Forum last week in Dubai, and there was a discussion, worldwide discussion, that banking industry is stuck in lending. So it's nothing very special for Ukraine, but Ukraine needs leverage much more than other countries. So, and this is the case where we are now. So we have a stable forex rate for last 2 years. Are we happy with this? Yes, as a banking sector. Why? Because we have a big portion of forex loans, foreign currency loans in our portfolio. There was up to 60%. So, and deterioration of forex rate made our portfolio with a high level of NPLs. We started 2012 with a level of up to 40% of non-performing loans in the banking industry by international standards of accounting, and we finished the year with the same level. So nothing material happens in the quality of portfolio. That's why we as bankers, we don't want to destroy the forex rate to make it worse. At the same time, what is good from 2012, that new loans starting from 2010, 11 and 12 have very good quality. What does it mean? It means the new business, new lending is quite okay. It's up to 4% in the industry, all new loans starting from 2010. So we appreciate very much. So that's a very good sign to investors to stay in Ukraine because new business could be managed. But this business is done in a so big number of restrictions, conditions, that not many companies could get loan. So we have an extremely selective portfolio with a good quality, but it's not enough for economy to leverage it with its development. And finally, so what happens with the forex rate now? I guess all of us know the regulation that appeared last few days was expected by the market, as we expected from days after election something to make a change, because the price for stable forex rate was, as I mentioned, high pricing and a drop in or decreasing of the national bank reserves. So finally, all of us expect changes because in this environment there is no long-term perspective, and these changes which are presented now, they are, I would say, more administrative and less economic. And what Max said, that flexible forex rate is recommended by many analysts, and our analysts in our bank do the same, so we're not unique. We feel that flexible forex rate can be acceptable by the market. And I would comment one important issue from my experience working more than 20 years with depositors. I would say depositors will accept flexible rate as well. Quite often this argument is a blocking factor to make flexible rate happen, as depositors could behave differently and could create a panic in the market, which we have some experience on that. So this new regulation somewhere tries to prevent this panic by administrative measures. I would say we still believe that slight depreciation, I would say up to 10% for Ukraine is slight depreciation, could be positive for economy and could be a scenario for 2013. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll have one small follow-up question with the banking sector. So what you are saying currently with limited liquidity that good lending, good quality lending is good. So let's say for foreign banks that invest in many countries, is it okay to tolerate a low level of lending even if it's a very good quality? Can be sustainable, or it's still like some transition period that should be ended sometime soon?
Good quality is a result of very restrictive credit policy. That's why I would say the volume of portfolio is small to make attractive market for investors to come to Ukraine with funding, with bigger capital and big investments. So this is a selective number of customers with a good quality of portfolio, good financials, and that's, I would say, cannot satisfy us as the market players in the market. At the same time, what is not sorted out is a legal environment and court system. Banking industry does have more than 180 court cases with the problem loans. Some banks like ours has more than 10,000 court cases. We started year 2012 with this number, and we end 2012 with this number of problem negotiations with the customers. And many of them cannot sell the loan, and some of them have arguments to fight with the industry. So with all these changes, we can't expect the increase of volumes of loan portfolio. And having these obstacles in developing of the new products or taking more risks in the not stable and not predictable legal environment, I would say this good quality will be in small volumes for a few next years. We can predict that. Thank you.
You said very good numbers, well, a very, I think, indicative number about number of lawsuits, and maybe it's my personal interest coming up, but for example, when I heard that, for example, if there are cases with the tax authorities, 97% of those cases they win. So, well, do you have some estimate with a number, how many cases, percentage maybe estimate in banking sectors the banks win, so understand who is winning, is it a parity, do you see the problem, developing, improving, or vice versa?
That's a very sensitive question, and I wouldn't like to have a very sensitive answer, because tax is a very sensitive issue. What I can confirm that the application of the tax law is different in different cases, And market does have a very good support from auditors, from legal companies and others to create the common understanding how tax law should be implemented or applied to this or that case. And this makes not comfortable for many of market players what to expect from the next inspection, this or that. So very probably number of such conflicts between tax and market players and banks could be high. But I still optimist, could be very surprised for the current days. I still believe that we have tools to communicate. We personally use associations. There was European Business Association named, there is the American Chamber of Commerce, there is a Banking Association. We believe that talks with the governors and supervisors is possible. They take place. It's not easy. But I'm still optimistic that problematic cases is a subject for the clarification, and I would say, I would like to dramatize the issue. Number is big, but from our experience, it's manageable.
Actually, I will correct myself with the questions that was not about the tax authorities. We don't ask the questions about tax authorities, it's probably about between creditors and borrowers, this balance, because I remember after 2008 there was a lot of media saying that banking will lose in some cases, legal cases, because of unoptimal environment and low protection for banking systems. So is it improving gradually with the National Bank doing something in that respect?
Yes, there is a new law to protect creditors and borrowers, which make influence on the technical issues, which are important. But still, I would name tax consequences are critical, because without debt settlement and forgiveness of some part of the debt, there is no solution for majority of customers. So existing income of majority of our bad borrowers, could I say bad borrowers, is not enough to serve big loans taken in 2007 in a foreign currency. So debt settlement is the issue that could help. And before we have a clear understanding of the tax consequences in a year, on a 2 years, on a 3 years, and possible sanctions or penalties, we don't make many of such deals. First issue, we will not find many portfolio sales in the market, and mostly because of this issue, because of not clear definitions what is acceptable by tax regulation.
Okay, we move forward and we move to another topic which is very hot also. So we have a big issue about the gas price and about gas relations. I won't ask questions when we have a new negotiation with Russia. People who can answer, there are probably just 2-3 in the country and they're not here. But I will ask Alexei Timofeyev based on his, I'm sorry, based on his experience. Based on his experience, is it really a myth or reality? And actually, how many years it could take before Ukraine will gain enough level of gas independence? How much money? Is it huge capex? Not? Maybe how many years? Some estimate for us to understand the size of the problem.
Для того, чтобы подойти к этому вопросу, я считаю, нужно разделить проблематику на несколько составляющих. В тематике панели было заявлено таможенный союз, влияние цены на газ. Вот я считаю, что таможенный союз, и это отдельная тема, заслуживающая отдельной конференции, и вовсе не газ является последней точкой, которая определяет, намеревается Украина вступать в таможенный союз с Россией или существовать в конфигурации с Евросоюзом. Это проблема политического выбора. Безусловно, и в такой конфигурации страна будет жить, экономика будет развиваться. Вопрос только, кем Украина себя хочет видеть, и газ здесь не является каким-то последним гвоздем, который нужно забить, чтобы корабль поплыл. С точки зрения цены на газ я выскажу, может быть, не очень популярное мнение, но тем не менее я считаю, что Украине высокая цена на газ была нужна. Без вот этого кризиса, без вот этого давления цены на энергетику в целом, на наших политиков, на наших функционеров, которые работают в этой сфере, в том числе и на компании, которые являются потребителями газа, без вот этого давления достаточно сложно было бы прогнозировать, когда при снабжении дешевым газом, в Украине вообще задумались бы об энергоэффективности, о развитии собственной добычи, о развитии альтернативной энергетики. И здесь, как ни парадоксально, высокая цена на газ, хотя она значительно ухудшает баланс, макроэкономические показатели, тем не менее является главным стимулом изменений, которые сейчас вот только-только начинают происходить. Поэтому я опасаюсь, что, возможно, договорившись с Россией, получив какую-то значительную скидку, все эти вещи будут заморожены на период действия этой скидки. Ну, к сожалению, в данной ситуации это так. Какие существуют сценарии по цене на газ? Что вообще в индустрии может происходить? Существует 3 базовых сценария, которые на самом деле равновероятны. Первый сценарий. Продолжает действовать нефтяная формула. Цена нефти, там, Brent, Urals в районе $100. Это значит, что газ будет находиться на отметке там, порядка $400 без НДС здесь внутри на рынке Украины. Второй сценарий. Украина получит небольшую скидку, так как получили практически все европейские потребители «Газпрома» через суд, либо путем договоренности. Иногда это была ретро-скидка с компенсацией части сумм, полученных за прошлый год. Это 10% или 15% от действующей цены. Ну, для того, чтобы где-то сравняться со среднеевропейской ценой, мы должны получить скидку 25%. Ясно, что за эту уступку, наверное, мы не должны ни в таможенный союз вступать, ни передавать ГТС, но опять же это вопрос политики. Такой сценарий возможен. Третий сценарий, я его называю апокалиптическим для украинской собственной газодобычи, но он наиболее в краткосрочной перспективе привлекательный для украинских потребителей газа, это получение внутренней цены на газ. Так называемая интеграционная скидка, при которой цена на газ на границе Украины становится порядка там, $160. Другой вопрос, по какой цене здесь этот газ будет продавать НАК «Нефтегаз», который испытывает большую проблему с собственным балансом, большую проблему с финансированием собственных расходов. Не факт, что дешевый российский газ напрямую будет также дешево продаваться в Украине. Скорее всего, часть своей маржи заложит НАК «Нефтегаз», которому нужно решать свои проблемы с долговой нагрузкой и т.д. и т.п. Наиболее привлекательный сценарий для бизнеса, безусловно, это ориентирование на европейскую цену, которая является из себя миксом контрактной, спотовой цены, LNG поставок. Мы в долгосрочной перспективе видим эту цену в районе $300. Ориентирование на европейские стандарты в энергетической политике, потому что для Европы энергетические стандарты – это диверсификация, это независимость, это конкуренция. Российские стандарты, и это очевидно, это обратное огосударствление, это монополизация и это формирование энергетической и добычной отрасли, как отрасли, на которой базируется и бюджетная политика, и т.д. и т.п. Я считаю, что Украина уже ближе по своей модели к Европе, это движение надо продолжать. Поэтому, подытоживая вот этот небольшой обзор, я могу сказать, что в индустрии на следующий год существует абсолютная неопределенность с точки зрения цены на газ. Та же самая история, которая повторялась в прошлом году, когда все сдали, вот-вот будет договоренность, вот-вот скидка. Это напрямую влияет на уровень инвестиций. Если мы получим интеграционную скидку, можно забыть о добыче сложных углеводородов, залегающих в нетрадиционных условиях, можно забыть о шельфе. При цене газа там в $150 или в 200, аэрары этих проектов уходят в минус. Поэтому среднеевропейская цена не просто так сложилась, она отражает какой-то баланс инвестиций в этой отрасли и требуемой маржинальности. С точки зрения краткосрочного эффекта интеграционная скидка будет действовать несколько лет. У «Газпрома» существует политика равнодоходности. Они хотят продавать всем своим потребителям, включая Россию, газ по цене, сопоставимой с европейскими потребителями, средневзвешенная. «Газпром» нуждается в больших инвестициях, эффективность этой компании – отдельный разговор. Поэтому самый менее вероятный сценарий – это получение дешевого газа в длительной перспективе. Таким образом, мы должны ориентироваться на то, что газ будет продолжаться оставаться дорогим. Я думаю, что самая реальная скидка, которая может быть в ближайшее время получена в районе 25%, такая цена продолжит поддерживать инвестиции в энергоэффективность, такая цена продолжит поддерживать внутренние проекты. Вопрос о капиталоемкости этих проектов. В этом году было презентовано достаточно фундаментальное исследование Кембриджской ассоциации энергетических исследований, которые проанализировали ресурсный потенциал Украины, потенциал энергоэффективности и так далее. Их вывод то, что мы в десятилетней перспективе должны инвестировать не менее 10 миллиардов долларов в год для того, чтобы выйти на полную энергетическую независимость. Это астрономические цифры для Украины в целом и, безусловно, астрономические цифры для нефтегазовой и вообще энергетической отрасли, абсолютно неподъемные с точки зрения внутренних инвесторов, абсолютно неподъемные с точки зрения государственных инвестиций. Мы не Китай, к сожалению, и даже не Польша, поэтому все, что может сделать в этом деле Украина, это максимальная инвестиционная привлекательность данных рынков. Данные рынки, данные проекты априори длительные, многолетние, иногда даже многодесятилетние, если мы говорим о разработке больших каких-то залежей нетрадиционного газа и так далее. То, что хотят видеть инвесторы, это правительственные гарантии о сохранении уровня их маржинальности, а уровень их маржинальности напрямую зависит от уровня налогов, от уровня дополнительных сборов. Ну, рыночный риск они принимают на себя, как и мы, собственно говоря, как такой же инвестор, может быть не такой глобальный, как Shell или Chevron, но Smart Energy инвестирует как раз в добычу украинского газа и производство топлива из биомассы. У нас действующие проекты, мы уже находимся в инвестициях, мы прекрасно понимаем экономику и всю проблематику. Я хочу сказать, что наиболее чувствительный вопрос для нас это маржинальность, потому что большой капекс рисковый, и маржинальность она должна быть, и это вовсе не подарок, вот такая высокая цена, это вовсе не подарок нам как инвесторам, такая высокая цена заставляет нас больше инвестировать. На самом деле тут, вот как я говорил, есть и плюсы, есть и минусы. В общем, мы рассчитываем на то, что вот в рамках здравого смысла вот отрасль будет развиваться так. Соответственно, мы рассчитываем на то, что слишком высокая политическая цена не может быть заплачена за достаточно коммерческий вопрос, такой как цена на газ, который уже там 15 раз был решен в пользу потребителей в Европе, и мы там чуть ли не последние в очереди, которые до сих пор не договорились о скидке, всячески политизируя этот вопрос. Тем не менее, механизм разбирательств в рамках контракта существует, он отработан всеми странами. Думаю, здесь можно рассчитывать и на поддержку Евросоюза и так далее. Ну, решать, так сказать, политикам. К сожалению, здесь мы, как бизнес, будем принимать любое решение и обеспечивать выживаемость наших инвестиций в рамках любых внешних условий. Альтернативная энергетика на самом деле вещь замечательная, но масштабирование ее еще более сложная с точки зрения времени, затрат и так далее, чем замена наращивание добычи, либо понижение входной цены традиционных энергоносителей углеводородов. Экономика в моменте выглядит замечательно. Ветер хорошо, биомасса хорошо, но масштабирование этих технологий до уровня, когда они могут замещать реально то, что сейчас сжигается в Украине, это уголь, газ, мазут. Есть еще отдельная тема нефтепродукты, точно такая же зависимость от внешних поставщиков. Масштабирование альтернативной энергетики – это вопрос, опять же, десятилетий. Ни за 3, ни за 5 лет мы не создадим альтернативную инфраструктуру, при этом не решив вопрос, куда мы денем действующую. И опять-таки, если единственным вопросом или единственным стимулом, который воздействует на привлекательность этих проектов является цена на газ, то в долгосрочной перспективе надо понимать, что этот стимул будет так или иначе устранен. Поэтому альтернативная энергетика, она должна быть market-driven, она должна иметь такой stand-alone profitability, то есть она не должна зависеть от политического решения двух президентов. В таком случае это не бизнес, это как-то по-другому должно называться. С учетом того, что сроки окупаемости там не 2 года и даже не 3, надо понимать, что да и после прохождения срока окупаемости надо ведь тоже сохранять маржинальность, надо развиваться. То есть мы рассчитываем, мы ожидаем на то, что сценарий будет здравомыслящим. Это европейская цена на газ, это поддержание европейских стандартов с точки зрения диверсификации уровня конкуренции в отрасли, и это рыночные условия для продолжения наших инвестиций. Как я говорил, существенная скидка, я считаю, остановит любые реновационные процессы в этой отрасли, потому что просто потребителям станет неинтересно даже котлы менять. Вот. Также я считаю, что сохранение такой высокой цены, безусловно, приведет к дальнейшей депрессии в газопотребляющих отраслях и в экономике в целом. Поэтому вот между двумя крайностями есть поистине золотая середина, и я очень надеюсь, что в течение следующего года мы к ней как-то придем, сохранив инвестпривлекательность отрасли и решив свои политические тупиковые на сегодняшний день проблемы. Вот такая ситуация.
Спасибо большое, Алексей. Я думаю, в принципе, более такой фундаментальный взгляд мы бы в такой промежуток времени бы и не получили. Спасибо большое. Наверное, двигаемся дальше. Рассмотрим, какие вы сейчас, наверное, все вместе, может быть, наверное, в первую очередь обращусь к Руслану, какие сценарии или прогнозы у вас на ближайший год-два? Что вы ожидаете, что может произойти? Я так чувствую, что я автоматически с ходом Макса, я в принципе не обижу спикера, я вижу, что большинство уже перед обедом немножко подустали, поэтому перешел на русский язык.
I think Max already said that next couple of years are going to be difficult because the external environment is not going to change significantly. It's not going to improve significantly fast to have Ukraine have like very quick benefits just from external environment. Of course, in the global forecast and in the forecasts that are done by the headquarters of the IMF or the World Bank, we have some improvement assumed starting in 2013, probably more likely in the second half of the year, and of course Ukraine, as a very export-dependent economy, will start benefiting from it. But this is just a marginal improvement, and definitely this improvement is not going to bring Ukraine back to its potential growth. And if you compare today's level of Ukraine GDP to the pre-crisis level, Ukraine is not yet there. So in a way, the task for Ukraine is to grow much faster, is to grow above its average growth rates for a couple of years, just to be back on the trend, on the longer-term trend that was observed, let's say, for the previous decade up to 2008 crisis. That's why Ukraine not only need to adjust its macroeconomic policy, and Max has discussed it in more detail, but also to advance structural reforms. I think there are a couple of areas where Ukraine could do a lot, and the to-do lists are known. These are not new. This is the areas in which the World Bank Group are quite active, and one block of the issues has been mentioned as those reforms that are related to investment climate reforms, and Rufat has talked about it, and Max also referred to it as a next kind of building block after the macroeconomic stability is reached. But and there are a number of, let's say, fiscal-related structural reforms that I would like to highlight, for example, here, that what could be done in the next couple of years in order to improve both the fiscal policy, but also to improve the environment for all the investors, and also to reduce the footprint of the state in the economy, not crowding out the private investors, creating the more level playing field, and etc. Those areas are, for example, related to efficiency of budget spending. It is related to improving the principles of allocation money for those areas where the government, the state is a primary participant. It's health, it's education. With the same budget envelope, much higher quality of services could be achieved, and there is a lot of international experience, and many countries have been done, and we at the bank have all of the good experts that have this experience implemented and see how it all worked. There is a lot of potential to improve the targeting of social spending and social protection spending, so that the beneficiaries of the programs to support the poor are really the poor people. It doesn't go in up to half of it wouldn't go to middle class and to those who are relatively rich in the society. And again, there is an analysis done program by program that could be implemented within a couple of years horizon. Of course, it is linked, naturally linked to this long-term issue of a structural deficit in the energy sector, in the gas sector, both fiscal and quasi-fiscal deficit. This is a persistent problem, and actually it couldn't be solved without increasing domestic tariffs for non-industrial sector. I think, of course, it's like very closely linked to the discussion and to the presentation just before me. The big reduction of price, of course, would result in a big negative stimulus for the industry, but same argument could apply for non-industrial sectors. The low prices that persist for many years and decades don't encourage additional investment, and without the price signal, all of the energy efficiency measures would be limited. So higher tariffs would not only solve or reduce the fiscal pressure, would not only bring some fiscal benefits, would reduce the deficit of Naftogaz, would reduce the subsidies the state budget is putting into the sector, but they will also stimulate the most important signal to reduce the energy consumption, energy intensity of those sectors, because people would start calculating what their rate of return on the investment. Currently, with the price of $100 per 1,000 cubic meters, it extends into a future and makes people delay this adjustment. Once the medium-term plan is known, with some initial adjustment planned for next year, and then medium-term program of small semi-annual quarterly adjustments, then people would start planning. Next area of improvement, of structural reforms related to the fiscal, would relate on the revenue side. I think there is a lot of potential to reduce the pressure on business by leveling playing field and reducing the tax exemptions, but by trying to extend the tax base. And in the future, I think the fiscal space that created by this adjustment could enable the government thinking about reducing the rates, the marginal rates, but only after the base is increased. And again, once these reforms are implemented and much better capital budgeting process is implemented in the government, so those public investments that are implemented, they're being, how to say, processed in a way like business processed it, so that there is a new procedure for selection of project, procedure for appraising the project, and basically for implementation and making changes during the project implementation. Much more could be achieved with the same budget envelope. I would say that the short-term priorities would involve more of a reduction of the budget deficit, because that's the macro pressure for 2013, and this could be accommodated by some of the, some not very big changes to each of the sectors that I have just mentioned, but all of these changes has to be kind of placed in the more medium-term program. They are not one-off changes that would provide huge results. Next, coming back probably with the last point, coming back to macroeconomy, and I think that's an important point to highlight here, is the macroeconomic projections underlying the next year budget. I think it's most important, and it would reduce the risk going forward quite a bit if the macroeconomic projections for next year budget would be more realistic, would be in line with the expectation, with the reality of 2012, not based on the official forecast, reduced downward both on real side but also on inflation side, so that nominal GDP is lowered accordingly, and it becomes a new kind of starting point for planning next year expenditure, next year revenues. This would show the real potential for revenues next year, and accordingly it will show what is the kind of maximum expenditure envelope that the government could have next year. I think that should be the good starting point before all of these other structural related issues to be considered, starting from the macro framework.
Okay, Ruslan, thank you, because we are running out of time, and I'll probably touch very briefly, but probably one of the most important question about about currency. So I'll ask very briefly our guest speakers to answer. Are you okay if hryvnia, your business, your view, if hryvnia devalues yes, if it's modest, maybe let's say 10% versus 20%, and after that, will you, in which sectors you will invest in, for example, provide lending, so some basic view, and then we'll ask our audience for questions. I think they will ask more about the currency. So maybe ask Rufat if you think it's good or bad, and what industries you think would be good if it happens.
Okay, thank you. Well, if it's a small devaluation in the range you mentioned, obviously, I don't want to say it depends, but of course it depends. It depends on the sector, if it's export-oriented, domestic-oriented, and again, if it's domestic-oriented, how good the companies are in terms of being able to manage the risks internally. From the experience we have in IFC, being forced essentially by the regulators to lend only in hard currency in Ukraine, we cannot lend in hryvnia, unfortunately, but we do provide equity, which is a different story, of course in local currency. We have an experience of choosing companies who have natural hedges, either exporting or having very strong balance sheets and diversified within themselves. So if the export depends where they're exporting, they actually may benefit, obviously, as we all know. If they're purely domestic, of course, they could be disadvantaged. So it depends on the cost structure. I'm afraid I would need to use this word depends. But in terms of the sectors that we liked and we continue to consider sectors going forward, one sector that comes to one mind in Ukraine, it's obvious, it's the agriculture. If we look at a few years back and the composition of exports in the Ukrainian economy, when metals were accounting for 50% and the agribusiness for about 15%, now it's about 30 and then 23, 24%. So it's coming very close in terms of the share. So definitely it's getting more prominence, and agribusiness sector is the one we particularly like. Of course, you want to look at the interest to the sector from the point of view of the class of the investor, whether you are strategic investor, whether you're private equity, bank, or IFC, which is unique because we're not only looking at the commercial interest in terms of getting return, but we also have a developmental mandate, investing in sectors and companies which have the highest impact for the economy, for employment, for the tax generation for the country, for Ukraine now even increasingly more important, generation of hard currency, transfer technology, and so forth. And agribusiness still fits this criteria. So I would say here we are uniformed in terms of the approaches of different classes, many classes of investors. And for me, agribusiness is sort of, when I look at the numbers, is sort of the rule of 40s. Ukraine is home to about 41 million hectares of agricultural land, including the gardens. Ukraine is home to about 45 million population. The production in a typical year is about 45 million tons of grain. There are good years, like last year when it was a record, 56.7, I think. This year it may be around this average number. So if you look at the consumption per capita in Ukraine, again, it's very easy to calculate. Sorry, it's like production would be about 1,000 kilograms, so 1 ton of production of grain per capita. If you look at the consumption in Ukraine, let's stretch our imagination and say it's a total full carb diet that people are having here. 200, 250 at max kilogram per year is how much the people could consume if they really follow this diet. Let's say another 200, 250 could be in terms of the feed, and then for whether it's dairy, poultry, or meat products, which inevitably will be rising in Ukraine as is in many other places. So we have about 500 kilogram per year consumption. So half of what is produced is going to be exported. So clearly it's a good sector to look at. There are some issues, of course. If you look at the profitability by hectare, it's lagging if you compare to many other places, but there are possibilities of having huge territories of vast farms. Large farmers, of course, have very good access to finance. Small farmers have issues, but that's what we're trying to address, and this is where I think investors could also focus going forward. IT sector is another one. Ukraine is a top sector, as top country in the region in terms of IT outsourcing and software development, and number 5 in the world. again, it's a sector which is, I don't have time to go through all the criteria, perhaps not as susceptible to all these risks we mentioned when it comes to investment climate. But again, it's a matter of finding investable companies there, but there are investable companies. The fund, for example, private equity fund Horizon, in which IFC is investor, just recently invested in one company like this. So it's clearly a sector. And also Ukraine has also a natural hedge. It's still a big market, 45 million people. Yes, it's declining, not rising by 200,000 a year. It may be reversed, we hope, but even if not, it's a big market still. So obviously consumer products, and the good proxy for that is retail, that has shown that it has been outperforming the overall growth of economy of GDP. If you do it on a nominal basis, 25% as opposed to 20% for the overall, in terms of nominal growth. So I think it will continue going this way. It doesn't mean IFC has been investing left and right in retail, and we will do so. We will be looking for specific companies with good governance, are conservatively managed, but it's a good sector to consider forward. So these are just the three sectors I would mention.
Коллеги, очень интересная дискуссия, но мы ограничены во времени, поэтому будем чуть-чуть вас прерывать. И, поскольку это такая панель самая чувствительная для всех, мы бы хотели еще сделать небольшой Q&A session, если вы не против. Коль, то есть, если у кого-то есть вопросы, поднимайте руку, будем слушать. Мы просто видим, что люди потихоньку так переходят в холл, хотят кушать.
Сергей Зуев, финансовый директор компании Украина. Много говорилось о том, что реформы в энергетическом секторе важны, в частности тарифы, большая проблема. Следующий год у нас нет выборов, и у правительства есть шанс что-то сделать. Как вы оцениваете перспективы, пойдет ли правительство на такой шаг и будет ли что-то сделано в следующем году для того, чтобы провести реформы в энергетическом секторе?
Кому вопрос?
Идеально был бы Макс, но его нету. Может быть, World Bank ответит, может быть, IFC ответит. Наверное, World Bank скорее.
Добре, тоді, якщо можна, тоді я українською відповім. Я можу говорити щодо наших рекомендацій, щодо того, що ми рекомендуємо вже, причому далеко не перший раз і не перший рік, і це відображено в багатьох наших звітах, які ми підготували по Україні. Наша рекомендація полягає в тому, і наше припущення, насправді, в різноманітних наших макроекономічних прогнозах завжди полягали в тому, що протягом середньострокової перспективи кількох наступних років таке підвищення має статися. Ми його закладали і в наші прогнози стосовно інфляції, стосовно впливу і на бюджетний баланс, і на зовнішній баланс. Ми це закладали. Як ми бачимо, скажімо, в тому ж навіть 2012 році цього не сталося, ми маємо нижчу інфляцію, ми маємо більший дефіцит, ніж ті, про які ми думали раніше. Тому, в принципі, але всі ці проблеми вони зберігаються, вони просто переносяться в майбутнє. Тому, якщо дивитися з економічної точки зору, мені здається, є мало альтернативи тому, щоб таке підвищення не робити. Питання лише полягає в тому, як швидко і в яку точку ми збираємося прийти. Звичайно, питання нової рівноваги, нової точки рівноваги, воно залежить від усіх цих питань, скажімо, в переговорах, якою буде нова рівноважна ціна, чи буде нова угода, при яких цінах буде нова збалансована система. Але, знову ж таки, це є питання орієнтиру не 2013 року, це є швидше, я не знаю, орієнтир 2015 року, можливо, тобто середньострокової перспективи. Протягом одного року усю дірку, весь дефіцит закрити неможливо. Неможливо і нереально, я думаю. Тому потрібно просто визначити середньостроковий план і зробити перший якийсь свідомий крок до того. Це стосується і тарифів на газ, тарифів на газ для комунальних підприємств, тарифів на тепло як основних елементів. Тому що якщо якийсь із цих підвищень не буде відбуватися, то вся система якби не буде працювати. Звичайно ж, якщо говорити про тарифи, про цей блок питань, це не обмежується лише підняттям цін, лише тарифами. На нашу думку, є ціла низка кроків, про яку я, можливо, там не знаю в деталях, мої колеги з енергетичного сектору будуть знати більше, стосовно енергоефективності, яка буде застосовуватися не тільки в промисловості, а також і в цих секторах, і в комунальному господарстві, яке буде включати в себе встановлення лічильників, побудинкових лічильників у всіх будинках, які є в Україні, які дасть можливість більш чітко відслідковувати втрати, які дасть можливість мешканцям будинків інвестувати в нове обладнання і мати віддачу і контролювати свій попит, тобто використання тепла на рівні окремого багатоквартирного будинку, навіть якщо не на рівні квартири. І також третім елементом цієї проблеми і наших рекомендацій є саме покращення системи таргетування соціальної допомоги. І тут у нас є теж досить детальні рекомендації, як це зробити, щоб підвищення тарифів воно не вдарило по найменш захищених. На сьогодні низька ціна, від низької ціни отримують переваги всі, в тому числі і я, хоча, можливо, я міг би платити і більш високу ціну, як людина, яка теж мешкає в Києві. Низька ціна – це універсальна субсидія. А від більш високої ціни, звичайно ж, держава матиме змогу обирати, як допомагати тим, хто найменш захищені. Тобто ці три елементи, вони є, рекомендації відомі, вони підтримуються, ми їх обговорюємо на різних рівнях з представниками уряду, тому тобто це можна робити, але якісь прогнози, коли це буде зроблено, важко давати. На мою думку, це зробити варто в найближчі місяці, щоб це вже враховувалося в підготовці і в реалізації бюджету наступного року. Тому що це підв'язано під бюджетний цикл, це також підв'язано під опалювальний сезон. Якщо буде затримка на кілька, 3-4 місяці, то фактично це буде мати вплив тільки вже на наступний опалювальний сезон і на всі фінансові показники наступного сезону лише.
Спасибо большое. Коллеги, еще один-два вопроса. У кого есть?
Армен Хачатурян, партнер юридичної фірми Астерс. Нас модератор підстриковував до того питання, все ж таки з курсом. Макс Альє сказав, що Міжнародний валютний фонд стоїть на своєму, але його ніхто не чує. Ми розуміємо, що зараз взагалі до АМФ таке від уряду відношення специфічне. У мене питання до пана Володимира. Як єдиний представник комерційного банківського сектору, може НБУ дає якісь там телеграми, які не до широкої свідомості, все ж таки, в чому їх позиція? Попередня конференція «Банківський форум», там виступав представник НБУ, сказав, що ми будемо радитися з урядом, але позиція буде прозора. Цієї прозорої позиції немає. Ми пам'ятаємо, що криза в Україні почалася після того, як поповз курс і населення кинулося в банки знімати гроші, почалися конвульсивні рішення, які призвели до стагнації всієї економіки. Є побоювання, що таке може бути зараз. Якісь конвульсивні рішення стосовно продажу 90 днів валюти і те, що партія регіонів сказала, 100%, 15% податок на продаж валюти буде введений. Тому вони тримають цей курс, або все ж таки прислухаються до експертів, таких як на цій конференції Міжнародний валютний фонд, і випускають його поступово. Як ви вважаєте? Дякую.
Дякую за питання. Час обмежений, але я хотів би використати його, тому що, власне, його не можна уникнути. Пункт перший, немає секретних телеграм ніяких. І це добре, я думаю, тому що насправді інакше ми б заплуталися остаточно, що виконувати, що не виконувати. Це пункт перший. Пункт другий стосовно, чому валютний фонд або інші аналітики, які пропонують перевести управління курсом в площину плаваючого курсу, не реалізовано. Ну, я дам свій коментар як учасника ринку, тому що я в цьому ринку працюю, це не стільки академічно, скільки практичний коментар буде. Ну, зазвичай є причини, це наступні вибори. І треба, тобто, мені здається, є уявлення про те, для цього є багато підстав, що населення дуже швидко і панічно може реагувати на якусь зміну курсу, яка більше, ніж населення вважає можливим. І в цьому в цій точці зору стоїть уже не перший уряд і не перший національний банк. Я думаю, ця історія необхідності утримання стабільного курсу як показник стабільної валюти, що я, наприклад, так не думаю, є помилковою і має корні в Україні дуже специфічні, і це вже, напевно, більше 10 років. Тобто дискусія не нова, але вона, на жаль, ще продовжується. І населення в це вже повірило, мені здається, остаточно, і валютний курс є мірилом достатку і стабільності вкладів і таке інше. Якщо девальвація 10%, наприклад, а вклади 25%, то, що я бачу по рекламі, то гривня вигідніше. Ну, власне, це простий розрахунок. І таких прикладів дуже багато, практичних розрахунків. Тому, повертаючись, що може бути причиною, чому перехід, не чують цю рекомендацію, або перехід на валютний курс плаваючий не здійснюється, я думаю, що саме це ці політичні фактори, які, можливо, сприймаються як перехід до валютного курсу, як можлива причина дестабілізації. Я це говорив англійською мовою, можливо, не дуже зрозуміло, але я, власне, працюю з вкладами вже більше 25 років, причому в великих банках, і я маю таке уявлення, що населення сприймає зміни, якщо ці зміни зрозуміло комунікуються і тривалий час слова дотримуються. Тобто я би сказав, що дійсно інфляція більш важлива для населення, ніж валютний курс. Я би погодився з тим дійсно, що коли населення інвестує в іноземну валюту, то чекати міжнародних інвестицій – це є нечесно і напевно, не об'єктивно. Тобто без мотивів, щоб населення інвестувало в перукарні, лікарні, я не знаю, що іще, там виробництво авторучок і інше, без таких стимулів, без такої практики, наявна традиція українців інвестувати в валюту є небезпечна для самих українців фінально. Тобто ми настільки залежні тепер, що будь-яка зміна валютного курсу може призвести до соціальних конфліктів. Я в це, не вірю. Я думаю, населення достатньо швидко може сприйняти плаваючий курс, якщо його будуть вірно комунікувати, професійно і послідовно, і відповідально. Тому я би сказав, що вибори, постійні вибори і політичні баталії є причиною, чому ця рекомендація відкладається, я би так сказав. Не знаю, чи я забіг на політичну територію, бо я не хотів. Дякую.
Спасибо большое. Давайте, коллеги, еще, наверное, последний вопрос.
Спасибо. Владислав Гранкин, исполнительный директор РБК в Украине. Вопрос, возвращаясь к энергетической тематике, по поводу новых все-таки технологий. Многие энергетические холдинги, включая мировые, те, которые работают в России и СНГ, заявляют о том, что продолжают инвестируют достаточно много средств в инновационные технологии. Но Алексей абсолютно правильно заметил, что должны быть определенные стимулы, и довольно сложно масштабировать эти проекты в условиях экономической целесообразности, по сравнению с более стандартными проектами. В этой связи, наверное, вопрос больше к смарт-холдингу. Какая, допустим, для Украины, если как один из ключевых факторов, входящая цена на газ, какая должна быть цена на газ, чтобы, допустим, масштабировать чуть больше инновационные проекты, к примеру, ветроэнергетика, либо биомасса, либо, может быть, какие-либо другие инновационные проекты, чтобы это стало экономически целесообразным, либо, может быть, есть какие-то другие, более осязаемые факторы, если это невозможно, которые вы видите, которые приведут все-таки к этому. И вторая часть, связанная с этим вопросом, сколько, по вашим знаниям, может быть, тратит отрасль, украинская энергетика на R&D в этой сфере, и, может быть, какие, сообщите нам, может быть, есть более новые технологии, чем уже изъезженная ветроэнергетика, биомасса, может, есть что-то более эффективное, которое приходит в Украину, может прийти, либо есть в мире. Спасибо.
Говоря об эффективности энергетики, надо понимать, что эффективность – это как минимум четырехчастное понятие, которое заключается в том, что нужно эффективно производить либо добывать энергоноситель, эффективно его перерабатывать либо сжигать, эффективно транспортировать то, что получается в итоге, это теплоноситель, конечная единица энергии, и эффективно потреблять в конечной точке потребления. Поэтому, например, высокая цена на газ – это вовсе не проблема газа. Природный газ – это замечательное полезное ископаемое, самый чистый энергоноситель из всех ископаемых, которые существуют. Вопрос только в том, как мы используем дорогой ресурс. Он не плохой, не хороший, он для нас дорогой, используем мы, естественно, его крайне неэффективно. Мы там неэффективно его добываем, неэффективно сжигаем, теряем в сетях 50% тепла, а потом еще и отапливаем атмосферу. Поэтому, говоря вот о таком факторе, как цена там, на нефть, на газ, очевидно, да, не вчера и не сегодня начался какой-то всплеск интереса к альтернативной энергетике в мире, и я думаю, что вот когда цена на нефть и связанные с ней все производные энергоносители превысила 75-80 долларов, а потом еще и 100 и 120, то вот прошел тот самый стеклянный барьер, когда начало стимулироваться стимулироваться альтернативные форматы. Не только цена, безусловно, является стимулом. С точки зрения цены, там, всегда так или иначе можно договориться. Посмотрите на пример США, есть там замечательный доклад Уильяма Перри, бывшего министра обороны США, по поводу того, как мало США инвестирует в R&D, как мало США делает для того, чтобы освободиться от энергозависимости. Что уж говорить о других странах. Не только цена имеет значение имеет еще безусловно такой фактор, как национальная безопасность, значение имеет безусловно такой фактор, как рычаг политический на энергозависимые страны. И вот эти все вещи в комплексе, да плюс, если еще и существует ценовой фактор, привели к этому спросу. Вот текущая цена, даже не украинская, европейская, является более чем достаточной для того, чтобы эта отрасль развивалась, стимулировалась. Надо понимать, что ей можно помогать налоговыми льготами, административными послаблениями, как это, кстати, везде и происходит. Да, эта отрасль, она практически нигде не развивается без каких-то дополнительных стимулов. Но, тем не менее, сама вот экономическая составляющая, она присутствует. Я не думаю, что она будет ухудшаться. За исключением того самого сценария, о котором я говорил, если мы получим внутреннюю российскую цену. Тогда у нас, по крайней мере, в стране эти проекты будут заморожены, либо будут развиваться только те, которые не связаны с потреблением газа, либо нефти и ее производных. По вопросу R&D в украинских компаниях, это понятное дело, абсолютное большинство компаний не публичны, тайно покрытым мраком, безусловно, этот уровень недостаточный. Этот уровень недостаточный, и здесь есть такой вот как бы вопрос, связанный с тем, насколько эффективно украинские компании управляют своими ресурсами, своими компаниями. Это опять же вопрос общей зрелости бизнеса, бизнес-среды и т.д. т.п. У нас нет такой... Внутри индустрии нет ярко выраженной какой-то вот такого R&D тренда. Вот его просто нет. Есть вещи, связанные с модернизацией, но это не R&D на самом деле. Да? Есть вещи, связанные с новыми инвестициями в масштабирование действующих бизнесов, это тоже не R&D. С точки зрения новых форматов, довольно много уже в мире существует вариантов, что можно использовать для производства конечной единицы энергии. Довольно много существует каких-то кейсов, success story, особенно в европейских странах. На самом деле, до чего можно дойти, если последовательно реализовывать стратегию, например, замещения импортного энергоносителя доступным местным. Это там торф в Финляндии, это какая-то геотермальная энергетика в Северной Европе и т.д. и т.п. Любой из этих примеров может быть как-то локализовано, регионально, но в Украине может быть реализован. Да плюс ко всему у нас еще есть и атомная энергетика, которая на самом деле последнее слово не сказала. Плюс ко всему у нас есть огромное количество биомассы, как у аграрной страны. То есть вот эти все вещи, они как бы есть, и в Украине они есть, но вот в какую-то такую до сих пор машину, у которой есть там 4 колеса, двигатель, руль, и за рулем сидит вменяемый человек, который ведет эту машину куда надо, они не сложились. Я считаю, если честно, что это вопрос времени и эволюции. Вот это кривая обучения экономики, страны, бизнеса, внутренних инвесторов, Она должна просто дойти до той точки, когда начинается ускоренное развитие. Предпосылки все есть, первые инвестиции есть, первые успешные истории есть. Вопрос набора массы, вопрос, может быть, набора инерции этим процессом. Но, тем не менее, даже если все останется как есть, даже если цена на газ понизится до 25%, привлекательных всех этих отраслей позитивные тренды, они сохранятся, безусловно. То есть у нас все компоненты присутствуют.
Алексей, спасибо большое. У нас в стране, наверное, часто говорят, что не хватает такой профессиональной, конструктивной дискуссии. Мне кажется, сегодня была именно такая, поэтому большое спасибо всем спикерам вместе, каждому по отдельности. Аудитории спасибо за внимание. У нас сейчас по программе ланч. Давайте попробуем встретиться в 2 часа здесь же. Спасибо.
Спасибо. Я на 2 панели, мне уже физиологии просто не хватило.